He was only 11 when the chains of captivity wrapped around his young body. Not iron shackles, at least not at first, but silk ropes of diplomacy, betrayal, and empire. What began as a calculated maneuver by kings would soon become a slow, methodical descent into hell. For 6 long years, the young prince would be tortured not just in body, but in soul. His name would fade from glory into whispers. He was the collateral of ambition, a pawn in the Ottoman Empire's most chilling experiment, to bend a royal child until he broke. It was the 15th century, and the Balkans were a boiling cauldron of resistance and subjugation. The Ottoman Empire was rapidly expanding into Europe. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 had sent tremors across Christendom, and in the years that followed, the Ottomans tightened their grip on southeastern Europe with terrifying precision. Among the many Balkan states caught in the storm was Wallachia, principality rich in forests and rivers, nestled between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube. Wallachia was both buffer and prize. Its princes ruled with tenuous authority, often having to pay tribute to the Sultan, while also maintaining a facade of independence to their Christian neighbors. In this treacherous landscape, one man rose to prominence: Vlad II, Dracul, a prince of cunning, ambition, and precarious loyalties. A member of the Order of the Dragon sworn to protect Christendom, Vlad was also pragmatic enough to bend the knee to the Ottoman Sultan when necessary. It was under such circumstances that he made the most harrowing decision of his life: to offer up his sons as hostages. This was no uncommon practice. In fact, the Ottomans had perfected it as a tool of control. Known as devshirme, or the blood tax, they conscripted young Christian boys to be raised as Muslims, trained as elite janissaries, or retained as political leverage. But in the case of Vlad II, it wasn't some nameless peasant child being surrendered. It was his own blood, his sons Vlad and Radu, delivered into the hands of the empire. One would come to be known as Vlad the Impaler, a name etched into history with horror. But it was the other Radu Selfrumos, Radu the Beautiful, whose story, for all its outward elegance, conceals a torment even darker than impalement. Radu was barely into adolescence when he was torn from his homeland. A boy raised among Christian iconography, forests, and war-hardened knights suddenly found himself inside the geometric perfection of the Topkapi Palace in Edirne, then the capital of the Ottoman Empire. To his captors, he was not Radu the boy. He was Radu, the insurance policy, the symbol of his father's obedience, the hostage that would prevent rebellion. The first days were disorienting, blinding sun on white marble courtyards, men speaking in a strange, sharp language, eunuchs guiding him through rituals alien to his upbringing. But it was the indoctrination that marked the beginning of his true captivity. The Ottomans, masters of assimilation, knew that physical imprisonment was not enough. They sought transformation. The boys were taught Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They were trained in Islamic theology, military tactics, and palace etiquette. But underneath this veneer of elite education was a brutal reality. Submission was demanded not just politically, but psychologically, spiritually, and bodily. What history politely refers to as conversion often hid abuse. For boys like Radu, the process of becoming Ottoman was not a voluntary enlightenment. It was engineered, enforced, and in many cases, inflicted. Sultan Murad II's court, and later that of his son Mehmed II, who would become the infamous conqueror of Constantinople, was a place of sharp discipline and quiet cruelties. Radu, beautiful and vulnerable, soon attracted attention not for his lineage, but for his appearance. His captors saw not just a prince, but a possession. It was in these early years that the darkest part of his captivity began. While his older brother Vlad resisted, becoming increasingly withdrawn and defiant, Radu's path diverged. He was singled out for his grace, intelligence, and striking features. In the empire's twisted logic, such attributes were not to be celebrated, they were to be used. There are haunting records and later accounts that suggest Radu was drawn into a relationship with Mehmed II himself. Some call it a love affair. Others, more accurately, call it grooming. To the Ottomans, the palace was a world of hierarchy and dominance, where the Sultan's favor meant life or death. For a young, captive Christian boy, favor often came at the cost of innocence. Radu's status elevated, but it did so through submission. He began to wear Ottoman robes, to bow in prayer, to speak the tongue of his captors with fluidity. But beneath the transformation was trauma, carefully buried beneath layers of silk and ritual. His brother Vlad, meanwhile, became a powder keg. He watched from a distance as Radu was embraced by the very court they both loathed. Vlad's contempt for the Ottomans deepened, along with his hatred for what he saw as Radu's betrayal. But even this was part of the trap. The Sultanate did not just break individuals, it broke bonds. It fractured brotherhoods, poisoned loyalties, and corrupted love itself. Radu was now Ottoman in every visible sense. But what did it cost to be beautiful in a palace that fed on obedience? What does it mean to survive by pleasing your captor when your soul rots beneath the polished smile? The stage was set. In the shadows of empire, a prince had been remade but not in the image of glory. He had become the embodiment of what the Ottoman machine could achieve, not just conquest of land, but conquest of identity. His torment was quiet, cloaked in privilege, mistaken by many as triumph. But beneath the gold and marble, a boy still wept in silence. The transformation of Radu the Beautiful was nearly complete. Dressed in the opulent garments of an Ottoman courtier, draped in rich silks and perfumed oils, he was unrecognizable from the boy who had once knelt beside his brother at Orthodox altars in the Wallachian forests. The Turks marveled at how thoroughly he had adapted, how he had become fluent in their customs, devout in prayer, and above all, loyal to the Sultan. But beneath the surface of this graceful facade, the echoes of torment continued to haunt him. Radu's physical beauty, so praised by chroniclers of the time, had become both his shield and his curse. Sultan Mehmed II, only a few years older than Radu, had taken a disturbing interest in him. Contemporary and later sources, including Byzantine and Western accounts, hint at a coercive dynamic, one in which Radu was manipulated into emotional and perhaps sexual submission. In the eyes of the court, their relationship gave Radu prestige, but prestige in such a place came at the cost of autonomy. It was not affection, it was dominance draped in silk. Meanwhile, his older brother Vlad languished in parallel torment. Less pliable than Radu, Vlad's resistance made him a constant subject of suspicion and punishment. While Radu attended courtly ceremonies and received private lessons from Persian poets and Islamic scholars, Vlad was often relegated to the martial barracks, trained in the art of war but also in the bitterness of isolation. He seethed, both at his captors and at his brother. Radu, in Vlad's eyes, had become the Sultan's pet favored, coddled, and worst of all, changed. This difference in temperament would shape the destinies of both brothers. Vlad never forgot the humiliation of captivity. He internalized the violence of the Ottomans, learned their strategies, understood their cruelty, and later, when he returned to Wallachia, he would outdo even his captors in brutality. He would impale his enemies on stakes by the thousands, earning him the moniker Vlad the Impaler. But for Radu, the wound was of another kind. His punishment was not in pain inflicted, but in pain absorbed and hidden. Radu remained at court, and over time, began to earn the trust of Mehmed not only as a companion, but as a political instrument. The Ottoman strategy was simple: use Radu's royal bloodline to control Wallachia. A Wallachian prince who had embraced Islam and Ottoman rule would be the perfect puppet. And so, as Mehmed prepared to unleash his forces across Europe, Radu became a key piece in the empire's chess game. The tipping point came in 1462. Vlad, having escaped Ottoman control and returned to Wallachia years earlier, launched a defiant campaign against the empire. He famously impaled thousands of Ottoman soldiers and civilians on stakes outside the city of Targovishte, creating a macabre forest of corpses. Mehmed, enraged, led a massive campaign to crush Vlad. But resistance in the mountains was fierce, and the Sultan's campaign faltered. It was then that he turned to Radu no as a court favorite, but as a weapon. Radu, now a young man fluent in Ottoman politics and warfare, was sent at the head of a powerful Ottoman-backed force to depose his brother. The betrayal was immense. Vlad, once a fellow captive, now faced the horror of seeing his own brother return not as a savior, but as a conqueror. To the Ottomans, it was a masterstroke. They had not only broken one brother, they had weaponized him against the other. The campaign was brutal. Radu was not a warrior by instinct, But by training he was ruthless enough. He advanced methodically, securing alliances among the Wallachian boyars who had long feared Vlad's savagery. Many of them defected, tired of Vlad's reign of terror. Radu offered them a different future, one of stability under Ottoman rule, a future that many now embraced, no matter how bitter the cost. As Vlad retreated, his empire of blood crumbled. By 1462, he was forced to flee into Hungarian territory, where he would be imprisoned. Radu took the throne as voivode of Wallachia, not through national support, but through foreign sponsorship. His reign was never truly his. It was a gift from his captors. He was now a prince in name, but in truth, he remained a hostage only, now in finer clothes. Despite the crown, Radu's rule was fraught with peril. He faced constant uprisings, whispers of betrayal, and the ever-looming shadow of his brother's possible return. The Ottomans kept him in power, but their support came at a cost. Every decision he made was scrutinized. Every failure was seen as a betrayal of the Sultan's trust. He walked a tightrope between appeasing his people and obeying his overlords, and in that fragile space, he found no peace. At court, he was still celebrated as a model of assimilation, but behind the palace doors, his influence began to wane. Mehmed had other conquests in mind: Albania, Bosnia, even the gates of Vienna, and Radu, once a prized favorite, was slowly relegated to the background. His body aged, his beauty faded, and with it, so did his relevance in the eyes of the empire. He had betrayed his brother, his faith, and perhaps even himself. But what choice had he truly been given? Was he a traitor, merely a victim who survived by doing what he must? As the 1470s dawned, Radu's grip on power slipped further. Wallachia was restless. Enemies circled like vultures. And the legacy of Vlad, terrifying, blood-stained, unforgettable, loomed over every decision he made. Radu's reign, like his youth, was not truly his own. It had been carved for him by hands that never loved him, only used him. He had been a boy given to strangers, a child torn between thrones, and now a man shackled not by chains, but by memories. Radu's rule, though gilded in appearance, was a reign of ghosts. Every corner of his palace whispered of the past off, the boy who had been taken, the brother who had turned into a monster, and the price of a crown bought with humiliation. From 1462 to 1475, Radu Selfrumos remained the Ottoman-backed ruler of Wallachia, albeit with constant interruptions, challenges, and failures. His authority was never absolute, and his throne was never secure. Every decision he made carried the weight of suspicion, either from his Ottoman masters or from his Wallachian subjects, who viewed him as an outsider wearing a native mask. Despite the shallow legitimacy granted by the Ottomans, Radu struggled to earn loyalty from his own people. The boyars, the aristocratic elite of Wallachia, were not easily swayed by the promise of peace. They had lived through Vlad's reign of terror, and though they feared his return, many still respected his independence. Radu, in contrast, was seen as soft, foreign, and compromised. His appearance still held the allure of youth, but in his eyes was a weariness that no silk robe could hide. The Wallachian countryside, once proud and fiercely autonomous, groaned under the weight of Ottoman interference. Taxes were raised to pay tribute to the Sultan. Troops were levied not for local defense, but for foreign campaigns. Islam, though not forced upon the people, was given quiet favor in court. And all the while, Radu tried to play the part of a native prince, presiding over Christian festivals, dining with the Orthodox clergy, even praying in chapels he no longer truly belonged to. His identity had become a mosaic of contradictions. To the Ottomans, he was their success story, a Christian prince turned Muslim, turned courtier, turned ruler. To the Wallachians, he was a symbol of betrayal. To himself, he was a cipher half of nothing, caught between empires, never fully at home in either world. Yet for all his inner torment, Radu clung to his fragile power with desperation. He had spent too long surviving to surrender now. And survival for him was no longer about loyalty or faith. It was about proving that he could be more than a pawn, more than a prince who had once been broken. But the Ottoman court was not built for sentiment. Mehmed II, once the boy who had whispered to Radu in gardens of marble and jasmine, had transformed into the conqueror of Constantinople, a sultan feared across continents. His affection for Radu, whatever it had been, faded into disinterest. The needs of empire outweighed old obsessions. By the late 1460s, Mehmed's ambitions lay far beyond the borders of Wallachia. He sought Albania and Hungary. He dreamed of Rome. Radu, for all his efforts, was no longer essential. He was replaced multiple times on the Wallachian throne by rivals, including Basarab Lyota and even Vlad the Impaler himself during a brief return. Each reappearance of his brother was a dagger to Radu's heart, not only because of the threat it posed, but because it reminded him of the man he might have become had his path not been corrupted by captivity. In those years, Radu lived a life of constant displacement. He would regain the throne with Ottoman support, then lose it when uprisings surged. He would flee to Ottoman garrisons, only to return weeks later as the Sultan's chosen voivode. The cycle was humiliating, and it wore down even his practiced composure. Power no longer felt like purpose. It felt like punishment. But beyond politics, it was the silence of his personal life that screamed the loudest. Radu never married. No children bore his name. His court was a place of order but not of love. The halls of his palaces echoed with diplomacy, not laughter. Chroniclers noted his beauty and intellect, but they also remarked on his solitude. His identity had been shaped by others, and so, in a very real sense, he never fully shaped a legacy of his own. He did, however, remain loyal to Mehmed, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of trauma, or perhaps because Stockholm Syndrome had sunk its roots too deeply to be removed. Even when the Sultan's attention turned elsewhere, Radu remained the ever-obedient servant. It was the only way he had learned to survive. But this loyalty so prized in youth became irrelevant in age. The cracks in Radu's rule widened as the people of Wallachia grew bolder in their defiance. Local uprisings flared. Nobles schemed. Even the church grew more vocal against Ottoman influence. And as the grip of the empire shifted toward new frontiers, Radu's usefulness dwindled. By 1475, Radu's reign ended for the final time. The exact details are murky. Some sources suggest he was quietly removed by the Ottomans. Others hint at betrayal by his own nobles. A few claim he simply died of illness, his body worn down by the years of stress, pressure, and silent grief. Regardless of the cause, his death was not marked by grandeur. There were no epic battles, no noble last stands, no monuments erected in his name. He died not as a hero, nor even as a villain. He died as a forgotten prince, once used by the most powerful empire on earth, now discarded like a dulled blade. And yet, for all his silence, for all his outward elegance, Radu's story remains one of the most tragic in Balkan history. He was a boy handed over as a token, a child who became a favorite in the court of his captors, a man who wore a crown forged in betrayal. His life was not his own, his rule not his to shape, his legacy, a ghost drifting between admiration and revulsion. But the suffering he endured, the exploitation, the manipulation, the years of subtle and brutal torment were never truly acknowledged. He was remembered, when remembered at all, as Radu the Beautiful, as if his beauty was all that defined him, as if the palace that devoured him had not left scars deeper than any sword could carve. The death of Radu Selfrumos did not shake empires. It did not ignite wars or stir revolutions. It passed like a whisper through the corridors of a palace that had long outgrown him. There was no grand funeral, no legacy preserved in song. For the Ottomans, he had been a tool, refined, obedient, beautiful, and, like all tools, he was discarded when his purpose had been served. But the shadow he cast, subtle and elusive, lingered over the fractured lands of the Balkans. And in that shadow lay a story not of conquest, but of quiet devastation. In his lifetime, Radu had been celebrated and scorned, adorned and abused. Even the chroniclers of the time were divided. Ottoman sources praised his loyalty and assimilation. Western and Romanian sources viewed him with suspicion or contempt, especially when contrasted with his infamous brother. But none could see the full truth, hidden as it was behind layers of decorum, religious conversion, and survival. Radu was a man who had endured 6 formative years as a captive, 6 years that would define everything he would become and everything he would never be. The sexual and psychological abuse he endured in the Ottoman palace was never openly acknowledged in the chronicles. Such matters were taboo, especially when they involved royalty. But they are whispered between the lines, in the cold euphemisms of historical language, favored by the Sultan, kept close in the inner court, granted exceptional proximity. In an age when power dictated affection, and youth was often currency, these phrases are not just innocent descriptors, they are clues to a deeper, unspoken cruelty. And what of his supposed relationship with Mehmed II? In Ottoman tradition, the Sultan was above question. To suggest that he might have exploited a boy, even one as politically useful as Radu, was unthinkable in official accounts. But European and Byzantine writers less beholden to the Sultan's mythos were not so shy. Some, like Leonikos Chakokondyles and Michael Critobulus, hinted at the closeness between the two. Later writers were even more explicit, describing Radu as Mehmed's beloved, and in doing so, painting him as weak, submissive, even effeminate, entirely misunderstanding the dynamics of power and victimhood. Because Radu was not weak, he was surviving. Every smile he gave the Sultan, every prayer in Arabic, every bow and gesture of loyalty was all armor. For a boy taken from his home, forced to abandon his faith, family, and name, submission was not a failure. It was a method of endurance. But history rarely honors the survivors who don't resist in dramatic fashion. It remembers the ones who fight back with blood and fury like Vlad. It forgets the ones who bleed in silence. When Radu ruled Wallachia, his past in the Ottoman court followed him like a phantom. He had converted to Islam under coercion. He had served the empire that had broken his family. And though he sought reconciliation with his people, though he patronized Orthodox monasteries and claimed loyalty to the land of his birth, he was never fully trusted. The very tactics he had learned in captivity diplomacy, appeasement, softness were seen as foreign and unmanly in a world that worshipped martial brutality. The contrast with his brother was stark. Vlad the Impaler returned to legend, his atrocities reframed as acts of strength, his defiance romanticized. But Radu's cooperation was mistaken for cowardice, his compromise for corruption, his survival for surrender. And so he faded. When he died, he left behind no dynasty, no heroic tales, no epics in his honor. Only a name, Radu Sel Frumasand, the unresolved question. What became of a child who was beautiful in a world that punished beauty? Centuries later, modern historians began revisiting his life, peeling back the layers of distortion and propaganda. Some now argue that Radu's rule, though marred by foreign dependence, was one of the more stable and peaceful periods in Wallachian history. He brought a measure of order in a time of chaos. He preserved lives by avoiding the bloodshed his brother relished. But such praise is still tempered by the uncomfortable facts of his origin. His life was orchestrated by his captors, his identity shaped not by choice but by force. More recently, scholars and writers have looked at Radu's story through the lens of trauma. They speak not just of political betrayal, but of the psychological damage caused by prolonged captivity and sexual exploitation. These wounds, though invisible, shaped every decision he made. His seeming loyalty to the Ottomans was not a simple act of allegiance, it was the complex product of years of grooming, isolation, and powerlessness. In this light, Radu emerges not as a traitor nor as a puppet, but as a tragic figure on whose tragedy is made all the more profound by its silence. There are no records of Radu ever speaking openly of his years in captivity. No confessions, no memoirs, no words to describe the torment he must have felt. But perhaps that is the most telling detail of all. Silence, after all, was the final chain. He had learned early that his thoughts, his suffering, his desires, none of them were his to share. They belonged to the Sultan, to the court, to the empire. In the end, Radu Selfrumos was not broken on a battlefield, but within palace walls. He was reshaped, refashioned, and rebranded by those who saw him not as a person but as a political mechanism. His beauty, so often praised, was never his to enjoy. It was a commodity, exploited and weaponized. And when he outlived its usefulness, it was discarded like everything else. And yet, even in his quiet ruin, Radu offers something rare in the blood-drenched annals of history, the story of a man who endured, who bore the unbearable, who smiled through suffering. Not because he was weak, but because he was forced to be strong in a way that left no scars on the skin, only on the soul. Long after the dust of his reign had settled, and long after the impaled forests of his brother became infamous across Europe, Radu Frumos's name slipped into obscurity. His memory was reduced to footnotes and fragments, to whispers in dusty monastic chronicles and barely legible court records. His brother Vlad became Dracula mythologized, fictionalized, feared. Radu, in contrast, remained elusive, mentioned only in passing as the beautiful one, a man whose legacy was neither feared nor revered, but conveniently ignored. Yet the shadow of his story did not vanish entirely. In the quiet ruins of Moldavian churches, in the fading records of Ottoman court registers, and in the rare Western texts that referred to his rule, traces of Radu lingered like faint echoes. Some spoke of his administrative competence. Others criticized his effeminate rule, viewing his diplomacy and softness as symptoms of a man too long estranged from strength. But none saw the full scope of the truth, that Radu was a man whose entire life had been shaped by a captivity so complete, so all-consuming, that even when he held power, he remained imprisoned. His most enduring legacy, one could call it that, was not political or military, but psychological. The Ottoman strategy of taking hostages to secure loyalty worked frighteningly well in Radu's case. It had not only neutralized a potential rival, but turned him into a functional servant of the empire. And the psychological scars left by this grooming were so deep that even after becoming voivode, Radu never truly escaped. He ruled as a man still answering to the echo of the Sultan's voice. Every decree, every alliance, every attempt at reconciliation was shaped by a lifetime of forced obedience and loss of agency. But perhaps the most harrowing part of Radu's legacy is what it reveals about the nature of survival under imperial domination. For centuries, history glorified defiance. Martyrs, rebels, and warlords were memorialized in statues and epics. But those who survived through assimilation, those who bore pain not through retaliation but by adapting, were labeled as traitors, collaborators, or worse, forgotten entirely. Radu fits none of the traditional heroic molds. He did not rise in arms. He did not write poetry of defiance. He did not reclaim his throne by sword. Instead, he endured quietly, desperately. Tragically, that endurance came at a cost. There is little evidence that Radu ever returned to Wallachia as a free man. Even in his final years, he was under the shadow of Ottoman supervision. His movements, decisions, and associations were watched. Any sign of independent ambition could have meant exile or execution. His captivity, which had begun at 11, simply evolved into subtler forms. The leash was no longer made of rope yet, was woven from fear, dependency, and memory. In many ways, Radu was the template for future vassal rulers installed by the Ottomans across Eastern Europe. He represented the success of a system that broke men by shaping their loyalties, their identities, even their desires. His fate would be echoed in the stories of dozens of Balkan princes raised in the court of the conqueror, then sent home to rule lands they no longer fully understood, on behalf of a master they had learned to love and fear. But for all its calculated brilliance, this strategy left behind broken men, and none more so than Radu. The boy who had once wandered the forests of Wallachia with his brother was now a Gostov, his former self of his country, and of the centuries of coercion and compliance he came to embody. The palace that had educated him had also destroyed him, and yet it never acknowledged his suffering, nor did the Christian world, which saw in his conversion only betrayal, never pausing to ask why a child might abandon his faith. The modern world, in all its complexity, has finally begun to revisit Radu's story not just as a political figure, but as a psychological case study in captivity and trauma. Historians, trauma specialists, and even filmmakers have explored the implications of his life. What does it mean to be groomed by your enemy? To be praised for your obedience, while being hollowed out from the inside? To be seen as beautiful, even as your beauty is used as a weapon against you? In the centuries following his death, Romania's national identity hardened around resistance. Heroes were forged from blood, defiance, and martyrdom. Radu, who fit none of these molds, was excluded from that narrative. But in this exclusion lies a deeper truth, that not all suffering makes a spectacle. Some pain festers quietly, shaping lives in silence, and that pain, too, deserves remembrance. And what of Mehmed II, the man whose hand shaped so much of Radu's fate? History remembers him as a genius tactician, poet, builder of empires. But his relationship with Radu adds a darker dimension to that legacy. Whether their bond was love, obsession, or domination remains debated. What is certain is this: the Sultan did not simply conquer cities, he conquered people. And among them, Radu was one of the most tragic. In some accounts, it is said that Mehmed mourned Radu's death, that he wept, that he commissioned prayers in his name. But if true, these were not the tears of a friend. They were the tears of a man who lost something he owned. In that final, fleeting moment, perhaps the Sultan realized that even beauty, loyalty, and submission cannot forestall death, and that a boy you bend to your will may one day haunt you not with vengeance, but with silence. Centuries have passed since the quiet death of Radu Selfrumos. His name, once whispered in the ornate halls of Topkapi and etched in decrees from Wallachia, now flickers faintly through the annals of history, overshadowed by the monstrous legend of his brother and outshined by the dazzling victories of his captor. Yet in that obscurity, in that half-remembered void, Radu's story endures not as a tale of conquest or glory, but as a chilling meditation on the price of survival. There are no statues of Radu in Bucharest or Targovishte. No proud murals bear his image in the great monasteries of Moldavia. Even his burial site is uncertain, lost to time, war, and neglect. But if the monuments are missing, the meaning remains. His life stands as a rare and haunting example of a man who lived not by sword or by scripture, but by submission forced upon him in the most formative years of his life. He was 11 when his identity began to unravel. 6 years of psychological pressure, conversion, and suspected sexual coercion under Mehmed II molded him into a perfect vassal. The empire did not need to break his body, it broke his mind. And when it was done, it sent him back to rule a people he could no longer fully claim, in a land that would forever see him as tainted. Radu's tragedy lies not in death, but in living. He was not martyred for his faith. He was not hailed as a revolutionary. He lived, and that, perhaps, was the cruelest fate. Living meant walking every day with the knowledge of what he had been made into, and what he had lost in the process. He had been a prince of Wallachia, a brother, a child of the Orthodox Church, and over time, piece by piece, each of those identities was stripped away. But he was also human, a man caught between titanic forces. One cannot ignore that every step he took was calculated for survival. He tried to reconcile his loyalties. He protected his people from bloodshed when he could. He ruled with restraint, something rare in an age of butchery. But history rarely rewards restraint. It forgets those who compromise, even when compromise is the only sane choice. Especially then. To view Radu only through the lens of Ottoman politics or Romanian betrayal is to miss the deeper human dimension of his existence. He was the first among many royals, nobles, and children who would be reshaped by empires for their own gain. His story is not isolated. It is echoed in every child hostage used to secure a throne, in every noble sent to a foreign court for education, in every victim of political grooming veiled as cultural exchange. The phenomenon that engulfed Raduthi's stripping of identity under the guise of assimilation is one still recognizable today. His life forces us to ask, how do we measure loyalty when loyalty is bred under duress? How do we judge betrayal when the betrayer was first betrayed? And most of all, what becomes of the soul when the body is clothed in gold, but the heart remains chained in silence? In modern times, there has been a slow reevaluation of figures like Radu. Scholars of trauma and abuse have begun to reinterpret his story as one not of weakness, but of resilience. Not of villainy, but of survival. There is power in understanding his silence, not as complicity, but as endurance. In reframing his elegance, not as vanity, but as armor. In seeing his beauty not as seduction, but as a weapon turned against him by an empire that devoured the young. And still, the shadow of his brother looms large. Vlad III, the impaler, brutal, terrifying, unforgettable, become a staple of folklore and Gothic horror, even lending his name to the fictional Dracula. He impaled tens of thousands, and was revered for it. Radu, by contrast, tried to bring stability, peace, and Ottoman favor. He was mocked and erased. One brother defied, one conformed in history remembered only the blood. But perhaps it is time to remember Radu differently, not as the Sultan's lover, not as the pretty traitor, but as a symbol of those who carry their wounds beneath embroidered robes. A prince who smiled because it was safer than screaming. A ruler who walked alone through courtrooms full of sycophants, bearing the invisible weight of 6 stolen years that shaped every breath he took thereafter. In the end, Radu's life compels us to reflect on how we tell history. Who do we call heroes? Who do we allow to speak? And whose silence do we simply accept? When a child is taken by an empire and reshaped into something that serves its will, do we blame the childer? Do we blame the hands that molded him? Radu Selfrumos Radu the Beautiful was more than a face remembered by poets. He was a boy shattered by politics, a man forged by coercion, and a prince abandoned by both his homeland and his captors in equal measure. So let us remember him not for the throne he briefly held, nor for the empire he served, but for the quiet agony of endurance, for the complexity of a life lived between submission and identity, for the voice that was never truly his to use. And in doing so, may we finally give him what history denied him in life, the dignity of being seen.